I'm Michael Lynch. I'm the director of the Yukon Humanities Institute, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you back in the next and indeed final Fellows Talk of this academic year. And it's going to be a good one. I now want to turn to introducing our main speaker and commentator for this evening's Fellows Talk. Scott Wallace is an award-winning writer and photojournalist who covers the environment and endangered cultures. He's an associate professor of journalism here at the University of Connecticut, and he's an affiliate member of El Instituto. Wallace is the author of The Unconquered, In Search of Amazon's Last Uncontacted Tribes, and a frequent contributor, as many of you know, to National Geographic. His work has also appeared in Harper's, Grand Street, Smithsonian Journals, Journeys Quarterly, and many other publications. As our commentator and discussant this evening, we have Erica Holberg, who's a virtue ethicist, philosopher who uses the historical ethical theories of Aristotle and Kant to examine our own virtues, our vices, our conceptions of pleasure, and our account of how it matters for good living. Since she is the 2016 recipient of the North American Kant Society's Wilfrid Sellers Essay Prize, and her work has appeared in the Southern Journal of Philosophy, the Kantian Review, and Polis. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Scott up onto the virtual stage. Scott, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate that generous introduction. And before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge the Yukon Humanities Institute for the wonderful opportunity we've had this year, we fellows. Thank you all so much, Michael Lynch and Alexis and Yohei, Drew, Joanne, Nasya, and to our amazing postdoc, Elizabeth de la Zazara. Thank you all for your efforts for making this a really enriching year and experience for all the fellows. I'd like to thank all my fellows in this endeavor for your camaraderie and for helping me grow during this year. I've developed a special bond with the members of the UCHI Fellows Writers Group, but I've also had terrific individual conversations and interactions with so many of the fellows, and I look forward to building on those friendships for a long time to come into the future. I'd like to also thank Maureen Croto, who will be stepping down after 35 years as head of our journalism department, for generously supporting both me and my fellow journalism professor, Amanda Crawford, who has also been a fellow this year, allowing both of us to experience the richness of this fellowship. It's a big stretch for a department as small as ours to have let go of 2 professors for an entire year. And I thank Maureen, and I also thank everyone in our department for stepping in to fill the slack there. I don't mean to go on too long with this preamble, but I do have a couple of other thank yous I'd like to mention. The Yukon Global Affairs Office and Vice Provost for Global Affairs, Daniel Weiner, for his generous support for my work since I arrived at Yukon in 2017. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at El Instituto at Yukon, as well as the Human Rights Institute, the Thomas J. Dodd Research Center, the Environmental Studies Program, and several other departments and my colleagues in those departments here at Yukon. All of you have been extremely generous and supportive of my work and my research in Brazil in particular. And lastly, I'd like to thank Steve Uzel, a brilliant photographer and public speaker who has mentored me over the past several years. And now let's turn our attention to the Amazon rainforest. This is one of the most critical battlegrounds, if not the single most important battleground in the fight to save planet Earth from ecological catastrophe. I might just step back for a second to say that I've been covering the Amazon as a journalist for the past, well, since 1992, really. Since that time, I've taken more than a dozen extended length journeys into the Amazon, into its most remote redoubts, on assignments as diverse as illegal logging, oil development, the protection of uncontacted tribes, and allegations of impropriety perpetrated by Western scientists working among indigenous populations in the rainforests. And on these assignments, I have been in the rainforests of Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and Brazil. And as Michael mentioned, most of these expeditions have been for National Geographic magazine. The Amazon is vital to global climate stability. The Amazon basin is larger than the continental US. Its rainforests absorb billions of tons of heat-trapping carbon every year. The forest cover really acts like an enormous air conditioner to regulate the Earth's temperature, as we all know. But the rainforest's delicate ecosystems are also in imminent danger of collapse. This is partly due to climate change, more general climate change, but also because of forest clearing to extract timber minerals or to make way for cattle ranches or mechanized agriculture. Scientists have warned us that we are near a tipping point beyond which the Amazon will begin to unravel and its trees die off on a massive scale, undercutting humankind's chances to contain runaway catastrophic climate change. There are more than 400 indigenous tribes inhabiting the rainforest, including at least 60 so-called uncontacted tribes that live in isolation from the outside world. Indigenous lands across the Amazon form a critical bulwark against the advance of deforestation in the Amazon from outer space, from outer satellite imagery from outer space. It's plain to see exactly why this is. Where indigenous lands begin is where deforestation ends. It's no exaggeration to say that indigenous tribes in the Amazon are peopling the front lines in a fight that concerns us all. This is our fight, too. That fight is becoming more violent and more intense, especially in Brazil, in the past couple of years. Critics say much of the destruction that's going on is due to this man and his violent anti-indigenous anti-environmental rhetoric of the right-wing populist president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. Even before his campaign for president began in 2018, Bolsonaro had made no secret of his disdain for indigenous people. He's called them an obstacle to development, and that they should be integrated into the national society. That's kind of a code word for, stripped of their lands and their traditions and made to be like, ordinary Brazilians. That's because indigenous lands are legally off limits to commercial development. And Bolsonaro and his supporters want to open those lands to extract the rich timber and mineral wealth, or clear away the forest to make way for cattle ranch lands or soy plantations. Bolsonaro has even lamented that Brazil did not have, quote, a cavalry as competent as the American cavalry, which eliminated their Indians, so they don't have that problem in their country today. Those are Bolsonaro's exact words. Bolsonaro has made exploiting the Amazon's riches the centerpiece of a nationalist kind of Brazil first agenda. He slashed the budgets of the Environmental Protection Agency, FUNAI, the Environmental Protection Agency called IBAMA, and the Indigenous Affairs Agency, FUNAI. He has sacked or reassigned key personnel or put them under the thumb of his loyalists. Deforestation has surged in the to the highest levels in 10 years. Wildfires linked to the illegal land clearing has also spiked at the same time that invasions of public and indigenous territories, these are the lands most coveted by land thieves, cattle ranchers, and timber mafias, have also soared, these invasions. So in November 2019, 11 months into Bolsonaro's term, Brazilian human rights lawyers and Indigenous Federation leaders filed a brief with the International Criminal Court in The Hague. They urged the prosecutor there to bring charges of genocide and incitement to crimes against humanity against Bolsonaro. And in a somewhat novel twist, they invited the prosecutor's office to consider bringing the charge of ecocide as well. What gives the charge of ecocide particular salience in the case of Brazil is the role the environment plays in assuring the physical and cultural survival of indigenous people. Intact forest and unpolluted water sources are absolutely essential for indigenous societies to reproduce their traditional cultures and way of life, which are not only guaranteed in Brazil's 1988 constitution, which at least on the books remains in effect today, but also in international agreements that Brazil has ratified, including the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The prosecutor has also indicated a readiness to look at systematic destruction of the natural environment as a crime on the order of genocide or crimes against humanity. Thus, Brazil could become a paradigmatic case in which governments and corporations and individual leaders are held to account for wanton environmental destruction. Indigenous people and lawyers are also bringing charges against Bolsonaro in Brazil's Supreme Court and the Inter-American Human Rights Commission in Washington. Some of these charges have to deal with the government's negligence for failing to protect indigenous communities properly from the COVID-19 pandemic. But as important as these legal challenges are, what I most want to focus on today and with the rest of my time is what the fight for the Amazon and resistance to Bolsonaro's policies really looked like on the ground in the forests of Brazil. I mentioned earlier that Bolsonaro has sought to roll back protections of the Amazon in any number of ways, and many of these ways are enumerated in this document that has been brought before the International Criminal Court and other judicial bodies. He has made a concerted effort to tie the hands of the two most important institutions responsible for protecting the Amazon. As I mentioned before, the Environmental Protection Agency, IBAMA, and the Indigenous Affairs Agency, FUNAI. IBAMA was created in the late 1980s as part of Brazil's democratization process when the country was emerging from 2 decades of military dictatorship. At the same time, scores of protected reserves were being set up around the country, including national parklands and indigenous territories. Part of this process that was being established to preserve the Amazon rainforest and its inhabitants. IBAMA would monitor these areas and act in consort with other enforcement agencies to disrupt illegal activities and punish offenders. The system worked pretty well for, more or less pretty well for the first 30 years since the end of the 1980s. And IBAMA's ranks are filled with thousands of dedicated professionals who risk their lives to protect the environment in Brazil and the rainforest. But under Bolsonaro, IBAMA's mission has been dramatically scaled back. When in the field, the IBAMA agents have found themselves in the uncomfortable position of not only having to confront environmental criminals, their traditional enemies, but also they must be looking over their shoulders for lest they be sacked by their superiors or reassigned to meaningless desk jobs if they try to do their jobs too seriously, basically. 2 summers ago, I was invited to witness a major IBAMA operation against the illicit timber business in the Western Amazonian state of Rondônia. I was to report to IBAMA headquarters in the state capital one July morning, and from there we would head out to confront the criminals. It turned out that we were going to be heading to the far side of the state of Rondônia, like 300 miles across the state, where a week earlier, suspects hooded and masked had stopped an IBAMA tanker truck on a back road that was laden with aviation fuel, and they'd lit it on fire. The truck was on its way to supply a heliborne IBAMA operation that was operating against illegal loggers and miners in 3 indigenous territories in this area of eastern Rondônia. And this is the tanker truck as it was destroyed. And as we set out, IBAMA set out to reestablish the rule of law and to punish the perpetrators. Typically, these operations are launched in secrecy in order to maximize the element of surprise and to catch the culprits in the act, as it were, red-handed in the back country, where they're operating, illegally, often in indigenous territories or protected areas. But as we made our way across the state of Rondônia that day, word reached us that the loggers already knew that we were coming, and they'd been tipped off by Bolsonaro's Minister of the Environment, this man, Ricardo Salles. Not only that, Salles would be arriving himself in the field of operations the next day to meet with local politicians and business leaders, nearly all of whom are tied to the logging industry. In effect, Salles had arrived in Rondônia to smooth over any ruffled feathers and to assure the locals, including people engaged in irregular logging activities, that nothing too punitive was going to happen. By the time the operation actually got underway the next day, logging crews had fled there after managing to stash much of their equipment, skidders, backloaders, bulldozers. They'd also blocked several roads by downing trees and destroying bridges to further delay the advance of IBAMA agents. The operation turned to monitoring sawmills in the logging hub of Boa Vista de Pacarana in the northern reaches of the Espingao municipality. In sawmill after sawmill, IBAMA agents uncovered irregularities and outright illegalities as they searched the sawmills. The mills and their operators were disguising the provenance of their timber with fraudulent forestry management plans. Out in the lumber yards outside in the sawmills, we could see that phony plaques had been placed on trees. You can see the plaques here on the desk. These are strictly phony plaques that they just wrote numbers on and affixed them to the logs to try to make it look like these logs came from legal logging concessions. But the head of the operation, this man, Givanildo dos Santos Lima, who's an incredible guy and kind of like an Obama lookalike, said that all the timber that he's seeing here in these timber lots, all these valuable hardwoods like Ipe and Masaranduba, nothing of these trees are left in legal concessions in the area. The only conclusion is that these trees are being illegally logged on indigenous lands, and then their provenance disguised to make it appear as though they had been legally cut. Lima also and his men also discovered that in the days leading up to our arrival, that the timber operators had stashed timber off-site in a number of hiding places, hoping that that the IBAMA inspectors would not find it. But here you see technicians are being brought in by IBAMA to destroy this timber, kind of reminiscent of ivory burns in Africa. This timber is being deliberately destroyed, cut into 3 or 4 foot long sections to render it basically useless for any kind of serious commercial applications, because there's no other means of disposing of or using this timber. The only people who have the wherewithal in this remote location to mill this timber and turn it into something useful that could perhaps be donated are the loggers themselves, the logging industry itself. So the only thing that could be done really about this illegally harvested timber was to destroy it. The sawmills were temporarily shut down, but most in time have resumed their work. And IBAMA agents, meanwhile, in the last 18 months, 20 months since this operation, their own ability to act in the backwoods has been further curtailed by Bolsonaro and his environment minister, Salles. The number of fines that field agents have issued to for environmental infractions has rapidly and dramatically decreased. Field agents have also been directed not to destroy heavy equipment in the backwoods, which is one of the most effective measures that the environmental agents have for actually curtailing or serving as a deterrent for environmental crime when they destroy expensive equipment in the backwoods, which is also in many instances too difficult for them to move somewhere else without risking ambush at the hands of irate loggers and miners. Timber exploitation remains, timber and mining, the mining of minerals, these activities remain, continue unabated across much of the Amazon. And much of that extraction is going on inside indigenous territories, dividing the communities and posing a threat to the environment and an existential threat to the tribes themselves. The Seche de Septembro Indigenous Reserve is among the territories being illegally logged in the area where that IBAMA operation was launched. Several leaders of the Surui tribe that inhabits that territory have been the targets of death threats. They've been trying to find alternative means for sustainable alternatives to the destructive, environmentally destructive industries of logging and mining. And several of their leaders have been singled out, including these 2 brothers, as a result. Both of them have been the targets of death threats for seeking a different way. This is coffee and cacao are both projects that they're working on as alternatives, sustainable alternatives to environmental destruction. So here in the Surui Reserve, they live in great deal of fear that there could be reprisals from the loggers. And those brothers, by the way, told me that they do not leave the reserve anymore because they're afraid that when they might go into town to run errands, which they have to do from time to time, they're afraid that they might be killed while there. But as we'll see now, turning our attention to the Eastern Amazon and the Guajajara tribe of the state, living in the state of Maranhão in the Eastern Amazon, you don't have to leave your territory to be endangered by the environmental criminals. This is in the Arariboya Reserve in the Eastern Amazon, and this is a reserve that's surrounded on all sides by logging hubs. 5 municipalities ring the reserve, and all of the timber in the state of Maranhão, nearly all of it in legal concessions, has already been logged out. The only timber left is in a string of indigenous territories and protected areas in Western Maranhão, including the reserve, the Arariboya Reserve, which has thus become the target of incessant invasions by increasingly violent bands of loggers. So because all the valuable timber has been is left in these territories, they're under constant assault. Even before Bolsonaro, the Guajajara were struggling to keep loggers and animal poachers out of Arariboya. And as with the Suruí and other indigenous communities, some members of the Guajajara tribe actually collaborate with the loggers. They take cash payouts to serve as the eyes and ears of the logging bosses. They also sometimes mark valuable timber and hunt bushmeat for the logging crews. Here in Arariboya, the Guajajara have raised a volunteer vigilance group called the Forest Guardians to fight the loggers and poachers. Since both Ibama and Funai have seen their budgets severely reduced and their ability to operate scaled back, it's largely been left to groups like the Forest Guardians. There's also a group of women Guajajara called the Women Warriors of the Amazon, who are engaged in the defense of their tribal territory. An added element of, and these are the Guajajara Guardians out on patrol. Adding to the urgency of the case of the Arariboya, there are members of the uncontacted Awa tribe still in the Arariboya forests, exactly in the territory targeted by the loggers. I should say that the Awa, so when I say uncontacted, these are a group of 60 to 80 tribal nomads who maintain little or no contact whatsoever with the outside world. They still hunt with bow and arrow. They're hunter-gatherers. The Awa assiduously avoid contact with anyone, including the Guajajara with whom they share this territory. The Awa are among dozens of so-called uncontacted tribes living in voluntary isolation from the outside world in the Brazilian Amazon. And since the 1980s, a special branch inside of Funai called the Department of Isolated Indians has been responsible for protecting them and keeping outsiders from forcing contact on them. The policy recognizes the inexorable relationship between the indigenous people and the land they occupy. Like the Awa in the forests of Arariboya, the isolated tribes require untrammeled forests, unpolluted water, and freedom from persecution from outsiders to survive and reproduce their way of life. It's really an incredible forward-looking policy that straddles the intersection of environmental conservation and the defense of human rights and the respect for self-determination. For the isolated tribes are free to decide if they choose to join the outside world, they may do so, but they should not be forced to do so. But now, as the threat is now gravely increased, that their survival is at stake. So without making contact with the isolated tribes, with the isolated Awa, the Guardians have gone about defending them while they patrol and defend the forest. They've caught loggers red-handed, torched fully laden logging trucks, stripped logging crews to their underwear, and lectured them on the crimes they've committed. And the vulnerability of the Awa, and the need to preserve the forest for future generations. They've made powerful enemies in the process. Several Guajajara leaders have been killed. I arrived in Arariboya to cover the Guardians in their fight to protect the Awa in 2017 for National Geographic. The next morning, as the Guardians were prepared to head out and patrol on their motorbikes, a young Guajajara named Paulino, seen here in the middle with the sunglasses on, told me about the death threats that he'd received. He told me to use a pseudonym when I discussed his name, Olobo Mao, or the Bad Wolf, so loggers wouldn't know his real name. But they did know what he looked like. Friends told him that unknown men were going around the town outside the reserve, showing people a photo that they had of him on their cell phones, asking for his whereabouts. And they clearly understood that they were looking for him because they were going to kill him. A friend summoned Paulo from his hiding place, told him what was up, and Paulo was able to escape the ambush that had been set up for him. That morning, as we were about to go out on patrol, he was recounting the story in a circle around all of us, and everyone shared a guffaw that he and the Guardians had outsmarted the enemy, and he is able to avoid that ambush. The Lobo had outsmarted the bad guys, but in November 2019, in the same month that the petition I've mentioned was filed before the International Criminal Court, Paulo and his cousin Laercio, his cousin and best friend, that's Laercio, with the yellow t-shirt and the rifle slung on his shoulder, were ambushed out in the forest of Arariboya. Paulo was killed instantly with a shotgun blast to the head. Laercio was severely wounded, but managed to escape. He has vowed to continue the fight for Arariboya. This is what the fight to save the rainforest really looks like. It's dangerous and it takes courage. That same day, I joined the patrol of the Guardians that included Laercio, Paulo, and others. I followed them on motorcycles to the village of Zuchiwa, where a group of village elders had gathered. They knew I was coming. They'd heard I was coming, and they wanted to tell the outside world about the dangers they faced from violent loggers and intruders. They were being threatened for blocking the roadways leading into the reserve. One leader in particular, named Zazico Rodriguez, who's seen here on the left in the blue striped shirt, said he was the most wanted man of all the Guajajara leadership. He was a math teacher and founder and director of the local school where 400 Guajajara kids were enrolled. This is from my notebook from that day as I took notes, where he said, "I'm the most wanted of the leaders by the invaders and pistoleros, the gunslingers." He'd received multiple threats. He turned to me that day as I was about to leave, and under his breath, so his family couldn't hear, he told me, "I'm not afraid for myself, but I'm afraid they could hurt others." Then he said, "The killers never face their victims." Yet, in a disturbing kind of fatalism, he soldiered on. For him and so many other victims of violence in the Amazon, it wasn't so much a question of if he would be killed, but when. Last year, word reached me while I was here in Connecticut in lockdown that Zazico had been killed by a single shotgun blast. He was found on the road just outside the reserve. He'd been shot in the back. The first night I arrived in Arariboya, those 3 years ago, I was taken by Laercio and Paulo to Laercio's home. His mother, Iraci, was waiting to greet me.
pé do rabo, pé saca, pé de rabo, pé, caminhão, madeireiro, eu caçador, como no raro, é para isso que nós queremos você vir para cá, para vocês verem com os olhos, tanto que a nossa terra é invadida pelos madeireiros, pelos caçadores, criação de tudo, invasou tudo. Aí eu quero que vocês, como autoridade, tomem providência, porque daqui 20 ou 30 anos nós não temos mais essa terra, porque nós estamos chorando. Eu estou chorando aqui, não é por outra pessoa, não, porque eu não sei falar o português bem, pelas essas crianças. Muito obrigado. Meu nome é Iraci.
So Iraci, who speaks broken Portuguese, said, we are being thoroughly invaded by loggers, by animal poachers. They're destroying our forests. They're destroying the future of our children and our grandchildren. If the government does not do something to act, we will have nothing left 30 years from now. There will be 20, 30 years from now, there will be nothing. So in sharing Iraci's message with you, I would like to say also, before it's too late, we must save the rainforest. It's up to all of us not to abandon the Amazon's indigenous peoples in their moment of greatest need. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Scott. That was really amazing. I really, thank you for sharing that with us.
Sorry for getting emotional there. Yeah.
No, one of the things that I love about this project is not just how important it is, but the passion you bring to it. So it's really, it makes it all the more special and moving, honestly, much more powerful. So I'm sure we're going to have a bunch of questions very soon, very quickly. But I think that actually I want to start with where you left. So in talking with Scott in preparation for today, he sent me a philosophy article because he knows what I like. And this article talked about the difficulty of charging Bolsonaro with genocide, because you need to have what they call like an clear intention or a plan. And it was hoping that Ecocide would step in as a kind of gap, this criminal charge, to fill over where it was like, okay, it's clear what's going to happen if we destroy this habitat. It is going to mean the death of these people, the death at least of their way of life, so that Ecocide could act as a kind of bridge for the way that it's difficult to prove a kind of plan of attack, and instead it's more like a wanton or reckless destruction, is what Ecocide would help in terms of being able to charge Bolsonaro and others, maybe some of these companies or something like that. But I think that this like ambition for Ecocide, I think it's very admirable. But I think, so one of the things that the article did though, was it described how Ecocide is a structural problem, that it's not that there's one clear person at blame here or at fault, but rather there's all of these like perverse, vicious incentives that work together to create this kind of, I don't know what to call it besides almost a vicious cycle, where we have things getting worse and worse. And it doesn't seem, and it just seems very overwhelming and upsetting. And Scott, I really think that you are right. And I think that part of what this project is right, to be arguing that in some very important way, it's up to all of us. Like, we all need to step up and do our part here. But I just think that this is a very hard thing to understand. So I guess I just want to ask you, or invite you to say a little bit more about how you're thinking about responsibility in light of the way that what's happening here, this destruction of the rainforest, this destruction of these indigenous lands, is very much a structural issue with people, people with very bad incentives. And actually, I thought Zazika's quote was like very telling in this way, where the people who like most have blood on their hands, even their face is hidden because they're shooting people in the back. And so it makes it just very difficult to hold anybody responsible. So I guess I'd like you just to say a little bit about responsibility and how you're thinking about it in this situation.
Well, thank you very much, Erica. And by the way, thank you for being such a wonderful partner in this project. You've been tremendously helpful in helping me think this through. So thank you. Well, from the standpoint of us sitting here in the US, I guess, you know, I think one of the things that would be, I think it's heartening that we have an administration in the White House today that is seems to be serious about tackling climate change issues. I think that we can, for example, let our lawmakers, local, state, and national representatives know that we're following this issue, that we're aware of the importance of the Amazon, and we hope our administration is actually going to take steps to ameliorate the global climate crisis, and also to engage in some meaningful diplomacy and perhaps arm twisting when it comes to Brazil, to put pressure on the Bolsonaro government. The government, the Bolsonaro government, it is susceptible to pressure from outside. I would say, as a matter of fact, that outside pressure, press reports from international news agencies, and things like the case in the International Criminal Court, they get attention in Brazil, perhaps more than domestic critics who are after Bolsonaro in Brazil do. So I think that is really important. And then of course poverty and desperation in the Amazon is a big driver of a lot of the illegalities. I mean, the people who are manning the logging crews, the desperate day laborers employed by ranches to clear land or cut trees. A lot of these people are just trying to stay alive, but they also realize that they are engaged in illegalities and would rather be doing something else. And so I think there needs to be a concerted effort made, incentives applied to find sustainable ways to earn, for these people to earn a livelihood. But there's ultimately the Bolsonaro administration and the policies that they have undertaken have left them, in my opinion, vulnerable to these kinds of charges. Bolsonaro and a number of his cabinet ministers, so let's see what happens with this court case. It could take a long time to play out, actually, but probably could take a number of years, all told. Yeah.
Good. So there's a bunch of questions in this area about responsibility. So I'm going to first ask, two people asked about, in a sense, the bad guys in this story. So somebody was asking about who the ultimate consumers of the timber, the illegally logged timber is. And then also what role multinational corporations, I'm assuming that they're a bad guy, but maybe not. So you should definitely correct me if I got that wrong. But what role they have in this story?
It's a really interesting question. So first of all, as far as timber is concerned, there was a time, and there still is, but probably some 15, 20 years ago, the international market was much more important in terms of the felling of the super expensive precious hardwoods like mahogany and cedar. But Ipe probably today is the most valuable timber still being logged in the Amazon, because cedar and mahogany are virtually they're extinct in much of their traditional range. And some of that Ipe is going to Europe and the United States. It's a very resilient wood that's used a lot for decking, flooring, things of that nature. But probably 80 to 85% of the timber being felled in Brazil today is being consumed internally inside Brazil. But soy and beef and some of the other export and gold, you could say, you know, gold and diamonds. I mean, we all want our jewelry, I guess, but this is, you know, that the demand for gold and diamonds is feeding the market, is feeding, you know, the market and the demand for, you know, for these activities in the Amazon. And soy and beef, without question, are the biggest drivers of deforestation in the Amazon. Cattle more than anything else. Clearing land for cattle production and soy production. And
Oh, that's all being sold
and
internationally.
there's where multinational corporations are involved in that trade.
I see.
And some of them are, you know, have been trying to, you know, at least nominally try to source their product from lands that have not been illegally deforested.
Okay, so you talked a bit about the bad guys, and that's helpful. I think this stuff, honestly, I really think it's very interesting, the points you made about the people who are living in these frontier towns, who are the actual laborers carrying out like these crimes, and the way that they're not happy with the illegality, but feel like they have very little options. But how about the good guys? So we have two questions about the good guys here. So one person asked about viable political resistance within Brazil, and a very similar question about the political forces within Brazil that are there to try to stop what's happening in the Amazon and stop Bolsonaro's policies.
Yeah, so I mean, we're kind of at a very decisive moment, in fact, in Brazil. Bolsonaro is making rapid moves to try to consolidate his hold and to undercut the democratic institutions in Brazil. You know, Brazil, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, has only emerged from military dictatorship in the past 30 plus years. And the institutions are, and the legal framework put in place there in the course of the last 30 years is not nearly as resilient or strong as the institutions we have in this country, which, you know, we've seen in recent months how vulnerable they can be here as well. Bolsonaro is now trying to put his people in charge of all the positions where he could suffer a reverse or have his power reined in. So there is a democratic opposition, and there is a very strong civil society in Brazil and an opposition, but the opposition has been divided, very divided. One thing that we don't know how this is going to play out, the former president of Brazil, Inácio Lula da Silva, who had been previously indicted and jailed, was not able to run in the presidential election in 2018, which opened the way for Bolsonaro to win the election. He has been, his charges have been nullified by Brazil's Supreme Court, and he is suddenly, this has just happened in the last few weeks, eligible to run for the election next year when Bolsonaro is up for re-election. But there are concerns that Bolsonaro is stacking the deck in such a way that even if he loses the election or if he's impeached, which is a possibility, he will have people in place, not only in the military and in the police, but he is also moving to arm the civilian population, liberalizing gun laws and so forth, to, you know, in the apparent hope of creating a violent opposition to those who might want to take power back from Bolsonaro. His standing in the polls runs around 30%, which is enough to, you know, when you also have key people in place in the military and the police and the, you know, the apparatus of the state with these supporters. We don't know what's going to happen, but it's a precarious time in Brazil for sure. Added to that is, of course, the pandemic, which is raging out of control there.
You actually anticipated the next questions I was going to try to raise for you. So we had a couple of people actually who are interested in how COVID is impacting the story that you're trying to tell about the Amazon. And I mean, this might, maybe you don't yet have, I mean, I think this is the hard thing about COVID, we're still like in it, right? So it's hard to say exactly with any clarity what it's going to mean for how the story goes. But I guess I'm wondering if you have, so somebody else asked, and I thought this was a great question, and they put it in this more general way. So I'm going to leave this more general way of framing it open for you if you don't want to say something specific about COVID yet. But just like evolving thoughts that you might have about how you want to tell this story. So like where you started from and what you really wanted to do, and then how that has changed or shifted as this time has gone by.
Well, I think it's certainly become more, the lines have been drawn more clearly. I think we're arriving at a really critical moment for the indigenous people of Brazil and of the Amazon, not to mention the critical moment that we are arriving at as a global society in terms of, the dangers of mass extinction and climate change. But certainly the pandemic has helped bring that into more focus, helped bring that into focus, as well as the extreme policies of Bolsonaro. My hope is that with this project and this book that I'm working on, to draw attention to this very grave situation and to help the people, help my audiences, my readers, understand what this fight looks like on the ground. This is not merely a question of buying a gallon of Rainforest Crunch ice cream, although I have nothing against that, mind you. But we really do need to step up, and we need to be paying attention to what's going on there. And I'm really interested. I find that the story that these I would say environmental heroes are engaged in is a extremely compelling story to tell.
Yeah, I think that in these moments of crisis, I think you're right, things have become more clear, but I wonder what that's going to mean for how the story goes. I think sometimes when like inequality becomes more apparent, it can make the people on the bottom like maybe more competitive or more insecure and think, okay, well, we can't worry about those other people because it's like so scary right now. And I'm sure things are very scary in Brazil right now with COVID. I think, COVID in general has had this effect of increasing inequality. But then I think there's also this potential that when you see, hey, this isn't working, not for us, not for these other people too, there's like a possibility of banding together and being, let's try to protect all of us, these people, all of us on the bottom, all of us that are most vulnerable. So I think it's just an interesting question, and I guess in a sense, about what's going to happen.
Yeah. One thing I should add, or I might add, is that the indigenous people of the Amazon today, in some respects, are kind of poised on the verge of potential dispossession. I mean, there are a lot of differences, but in some ways similar to like the 1870s, 1880s in the American West, when the Allotment Act of 1889 and other measures and the serial abrogation of treaties basically reduced indigenous lands and corralled the people onto small lots where they were supposed to become individual entrepreneurs and give up their communal ways of life. In some ways, that's what it seems to me like some of the people behind these policies that Bolsonaro is trying to implement now are trying to do.
It's interesting. So it's like both, well, it's like an ideological vision almost for like what a good life would look like. That doesn't.
Well, yeah, and especially when you see what Bolsonaro had to say about the U.S. cavalry.
Yeah,
Too bad we didn't have those guys, down here.
Yeah, horrific. It's okay. Yeah. So I want to ask you two different questions. So this question is from Amanda. She wants to know about your assessment of the U.S. media or English language news coverage of issues in the Amazon, how that's contributing or has not contributed to what's happening. And then there's a related question, I think, from Jeremy. And he wants to know about parts of the story that you were not able to photograph or maybe even get access to in the way that you would like. So as Jeremy puts it, I'll just read it. How does the repression, violence, and fear affect your telling of the story? And also maybe your certain kinds of inabilities or difficulties you've had in telling the story?
Great questions. I would say, first of all, that, there in the Anglo sphere, if you will, in the English language press, there are a number of publications that stand out, I'd say, for, providing, some pretty good coverage of what's going on in the Amazon, though you could probably count them on, the fingers of one hand. The US television networks have vastly scaled back their coverage of international events, period. And traditionally, environmental issues have been seen as, kind of, uninteresting, or that Americans aren't interested. I mean, I had a producer back in the day when I used to work at CBS, and I was pitching stories. And she said, anything but an environmental story. What do you got for me, Scott? Just no environmental story. So there, we've been fighting that, but I think I think that there is a general sense that the environment, clearly in the last, year, since the cataclysmic fires in the Amazon, in Australia, Greta Thunberg, we're seeing in real time play out ahead of in front of our eyes what scientists said might happen, like, next century or something. This stuff's happening now, and people are aware of it. And I think there's a growing demand for coverage of the Amazon and other stories of this nature. But it is difficult to cover the Amazon. So getting to Jeremy's question, first of all, it's expensive to cover the Amazon. You really need to have news organizations that are willing to commit the resources to put you into places that are difficult to get to, whether it's hiring 4x4s to travel lousy roads in the rainy season, or bush planes, or river boats. All that stuff takes time and money. Secondly, danger is one of the limiting factors as well. I mean, I would have hoped by now, also getting back to COVID, I should have been back in the Amazon probably twice since I was last there, but haven't been able to go because of the pandemic. And my plans to still go back to Brazil are still up in the air because of the pandemic that's raging there, still unchecked with the variants that are emerging from the population there, and because Indigenous people have traditionally lacked the same kind of immunity to the pathogens, the contagions that have developed elsewhere on the planet and have been imported into the Amazon, or the New World, if you will, in general. But the other thing is that it's not easy to cover the bad guys in the story, or in any of the sort of major conflicts that are emerging around the planet. Just as you can't go off and cover ISIS. It's not so easy to get inside a illegal timber operation to see everything that's going on. That's something I'd like to do, but I haven't yet done. I mean, you can get with, small time folks who are clearing a piece of land that they know doesn't belong to them. Like, they're taking a piece of land in maybe an indigenous territory, but to get in with the people who are really doing like the hardcore stuff, these are seriously organized criminal groups.
Yeah.
And so they're, the covering that kind of crime has its limitations.
Yeah. Again, this whole keeping faces hidden, I think, seems like one very difficult aspect, where it's like, it's clear this is happening, but it's hard to actually pin it down.
Oh, okay, so when you, if the question has to do with, yes, so shielding people's identities either because they are bad guys committing crimes or they are, good guys worried about being killed because of what their resistance. I mean, yeah, sometimes you can, of course, and I do, you know, keep my sources, cloak them in anonymity. Um, Depending on the threat. But the thing is, it's like, and I mentioned this in connection to Zizico and Paulo. There's this, and several other people that I've known in the Amazon, environmental defenders, indigenous rights activists, who have been killed, and who told me ahead of time they're going to kill me, and um, and there's this almost like, it's kind of this strange fatalism. It was the same with Chico Mendes, who was, very famous environmental defender, murdered in 1988. Interesting, around the same time that the Brazil's democratic constitution was ratified. He knew he was going to be killed. There are others. I saw last summer news that a land activist had been killed in the Brazilian state of Pará. And I looked at this guy, the photograph of him, and I thought, you know what? I think I've met this guy before. I went back into my photographs and notebooks from 1992. I had met this guy then, and he told me that he was going to be killed. It took them how many years to do it, but he was killed eventually. I mean, and the same goes, they, in most of the cases I know, they haven't, the people haven't waited 20 years or 30 years to kill their quarry. So they want them dead more immediately. But there is this sort of acceptance that what they're doing, they're kind of backed against the wall and don't really have the choice of fleeing. They're defending their people and they're not leaving. They're defending their land. That's why this is like such an incredible story also, is that these people have nowhere else to go.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, we've already talked about this, but I mean, I really think, to me, that's how we see it. This is like a version of courage, right? Where there's like no good living possible. So even though, there's very little hope of actually getting through this okay, there's no other choice, right? Like death becomes preferable to just, just submitting and just letting this horrible thing happen. But this brings me to Maureen's question, which is kind of one of the first questions I had for you when you first presented to the writing group. So Maureen asked, what is the timeline? How long can this destruction of indigenous lands advance at this pace before it's too late to save anything? And I think I want to ask I think I asked already something very similar to you, which is like, is this a story of doom? Is there reason to be hopeful, or is this just, because we are in this kind of structurally bad situation where, all the incentives work in the wrong way, and it's very hard for any one person or even one group of people to change it around, right? It's like we need like everybody in a sense to change the direction that we're heading in. How first, I guess, so Maureen's question, how long can this go? And then also, is it possible still to have a happy ending, or is it just, because you raised the idea that environmental stories are uninteresting. I don't know if people find them uninteresting, but I think that they do find them depressing, like a bummer, right? And,
Yeah. Well,
and
so I guess that the case should be made for doing more sort of like solutions type stories. And there are solutions. I mean, those guys, the Surui, with their coffee and cacao projects, they're actually making some decent money selling that stuff to Europe now. But until we find a way to place a value on rainforests standing and not cut down. That's the big problem, is like we commodify everything. And so, a tree is worth more cut up into boards than, all the life sustaining things that it does, in terms of providing habitat for, animals and insects and birds, and the transpiration that goes through its leaves and creating the moisture that waters the farmers' fields in other parts of South America and actually, globally. So there is that, I think there is hope. I think perhaps that, and I think that these indigenous groups are the most, I think they are the main hope. I think, they are, I would say, kind of like the backbone of the resistance. And that's why I feel so passionate about covering this story and covering them. I think that in terms of, to get to Maureen's question, I would say that, well, so depends on who you talk to, or what figures you use. It's estimated that, scientists estimate that 17% of the Amazon has already been deforested. I've heard the figure is actually higher than that from some quarters. And generally the feeling is that if we get to, as we stray toward 23, 24, 25%, the fear is that the Amazon will enter this, will reach this tipping point that I mentioned early on in the talk, where all the sort of systems will begin to collapse, and the trees will begin to die off, and the Amazon will become a net, producer of greenhouse, gases of carbon, instead of, a carbon sink, and that the Amazon will be, irreversibly lost. That is at 25%, and most people 20 to 25%. So we're getting close. And, I guess most prognosticators who follow this thing feel that, we could be getting there at any time between now and 2050.
So I think I only have time for one more question, unfortunately. And I think that I'm going to ask this one by Christian. And I'm gonna ask Christian's question. I'm gonna try to also put my spin on it. So, can you talk a bit about the conundrum of a foreign reporter and providing a perspective to a country that has had this history of colonization and continues to struggle with foreign interference in other areas, that is economics? And the thing that I wanted to ask about as you were telling your story, I mean, there's no doubt that Bolsonaro is terrible and, not good for Brazil, not good for the world, not good, like, objectively. but I do, and of course there's reason to worry that he's going to try to do something like a self-coup or something like that, right, in the near future, which of course would be very bad for democracy, which Brazil had been, I guess, a leader, right, in South America in this area. But yeah. So I guess I'm wondering, like, to what extent is our business, I guess, to like try to put pressure on or do things, right? Because of course, on the one hand, the world is ours and we have this responsibility to try to help, as you said, as you put it so eloquently, to try to put value on rainforests just standing and not, things that we can extract from them. On the other hand, I do think there's a question about self-determination or, letting, and so I guess I'm wondering how that intersects also with this idea of you bringing this problem to, the Western or the weird world, however you want to put it.
Right. That's a really interesting question. Can I not answer it? No, I'm joking.
You can always pass.
No, I would say, first of all, the powers that be in Brazil, Brazil is a settler colonizing country. They have colonized themselves, the Amazon. They treat the Amazon like colonizers, colonizing the indigenous populations of the Amazon and, the entire country for that matter. But they are not, but I am sensitive to the argument that yes, we in the, global North, if you will, or in the United States and Europe, can't let ourselves off the hook in this regard. But, the indigenous people of the Amazon are asking for our help. They know that they can't do it by themselves. Not only that, but I think there's a large measure of Brazilian civil society, and a lot of the people who man or who occupy positions in like the Indigenous Affairs Agency, FUNAI, IBAMA, public servants, other people in the private sector. There are a lot of people who really want the international community to, bring pressure to bear on the leadership in Brazil to do something. So I'll
That's a
leave
good
it.
answer.
Thank you.
Well, let me just jump in to say thank you so much to both of you. That was a wonderful discussion. Lots of questions, well handled, moderated by Erica and Scott. To your former CBS producer, let me say on behalf of the Institute that could you please bring us more environmental stories? We want more. Thank you so much for such an interesting discussion. Join me in thanking Scott and Erica. Thanks again.